Did you ever wonder why it is that most people are programmed to sleep at night instead of during the day? If there's something about the cycle of light and dark that's telling us when to sleep, then shouldn't the sleep cycle of a blind person be different? As it turns out, many blind people, people with no visual perception of light at all, do have the same sleep cycle as sighted people. So now you're wondering, how can this happen? The answer is hormones. One hormone in particular. It's called melatonin. In sighted people, the level of melatonin goes up at night, or when it's dark, and goes down in the day, or when it's light. It's believed that it's the presence of this hormone in the blood that gives us the urge to sleep. If an increase in melatonin level programs sighted people to sleep at night, then what about blind people? A researcher named Dr. Charles Chesler tells about an interesting experiment. He tried shining a bright light into the eyes of some blind people. When he did this, he noticed that the level of the melatonin in the blood of these subjects went down, just as it would do for sighted people. Somehow, the eyes of these subjects, even though they were damaged and had no visual perception of light, could tell their brain when there was more or less light. Now, this doesn't work for all blind people. In fact, most of Chesler's subjects had no hormonal response to light at all. Further research may be able to explain the sensitivity to light in terms of the type of blindness of the subject.
A language dies when the last person who speaks it dies. But you know, sometimes people say it dies when the second last person who speaks it dies, because the last person has nobody to talk to. Well, of course, languages have come and gone throughout history as communities have come and gone. But what's happening now is something really quite extraordinary. Well, there are about 6,000 languages in the world at the moment, more or less. Nobody knows the exact number. Of these, about half of them are so seriously in danger, are likely to die out in the course of present century. Now the present century is 100 years, half is 3,000 languages. So, that means one language is dying out somewhere in the world average every 2 weeks. There are all kinds of reasons why languages die. One is physical reason when people are affected by famine, disease and earthquake. Another is genocide, when some countries deliberately stamp out a small language. The main reason is globalization. That is, some huge languages in the world, like English, Arabic, Spanish and French, and these are like steamrollers crushing the smaller languages they find in their path. A great deal can be done to preserve endangered language. The first thing is that the people themselves must want the language to be preserved. That's very important. The second thing is that the powers that be must want the language to be preserved. They must be respect for the minority languages in their care. The third thing has to be there, of course, is cash. It costs quite a lot of money to preserve an endangered language. Think about it. You have to train the teachers, you have to write books for the children. And all sorts of things. It doesn't cost an extraordinary amount money, but it does cost a bit. So without money, endangered languages don't have a positive future. A painter hangs his or her finished pictures on a wall, and everyone can see it. A composer writes a work, but no one can hear it until it is performed. Professional singers and players have great responsibilities, for the composer is utterly dependent on them. A student of music needs as long and as arduous a training to become a performer as a medical student needs to become a doctor. Most training is concerned with technique, for musicians have to have the muscular proficiency of an athlete or a ballet dancer. Singers practice breathing every day, as their vocal cords would be inadequate without controlled muscular support. String players practice moving the fingers of the left hand up and down, while drawing the bow to and fro with the right arm, two entirely different movements. Singers and instruments have to be able to get every note perfectly 7 in tune. Pianists are spared this particular anxiety, for the notes are already there, waiting for them, and it is the piano tuner's responsibility to tune the instrument for them. But they have their own difficulties. The hammers that hit the string have to be coaxed not to sound like percussion, and each overlapping tone has to sound clear. This problem of getting clear texture is one that confronts student conductors. They have to learn to know every note of the music and how it should sound, and they have to aim at controlling these sound with fanatical but selfless authority. Technique is of no use unless it is combined with musical knowledge and understanding. Great artists are those who are so thoroughly at home in the language of music that they can enjoy performing works written in any century.
Sea creatures are inspiring the latest devices that harness wave power. This one, called the Oyster, sits on the seafloor, and opens and closes as waves pass over it. Cables attach it to generators on the shore. Since the November 2009, it's been powering 9,000 homes in the Orkney Islands. Another device looks like a snake. The Anaconda is made from a rubber rube filled with water that floats just below the surface. When the swell hits the front of it, the tube squeezed above ripples down its links and power a turbine in its tail. Prototypes are currently being tested, but the full-scale version will be 2,000 meters long. This system also looks like a snake. But this one is made of steel. It floats near the surface, where waves make its joints move. This drive hydraulic system that power electrical generators, like the Anaconda. It's still being tested. Results will prove that these devices are up to the job of supplying viable sources of green energy. Key to forming strong brain architecture is what's known as serve and return interaction with adults. In this developmental game, new neural connections form in the brain as young children instinctively serve through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures, and adults return the serve, responding in a very directed, meaningful way. It starts very early in life when a baby coos and the adult interacts and directs the baby's attention to a face or hand. This interaction forms the foundation of brain architecture upon which all future development will be built. It helps create neural connections between all the different areas of the brain, building the emotional and cognitive skills children need in life. For example, here's how it works for literacy and language skills. When the baby sees an object, the adult says its name. This makes connections in the baby's brain between particular sounds and their corresponding objects. Later, adults show young children that those objects and sounds can also be represented by marks on a page. With continued support from adults, children then learn how to decipher writing and, eventually, to write themselves. Each stage builds on what came before. Ensuring that children have adult caregivers who consistently engage in serve and return interaction, beginning in infancy, builds the foundation in the brain for all the learning, behavior, and health that follow.
The brain is basically built from the bottom up. First, the brain builds basic circuits that are responsible for basic skills, and then more complex circuits are built on top of those basic circuits as we develop more complex skills. Biologically, the brain is prepared to be shaped by experience. It's expecting the experiences that a young child has to literally influence the formation of its circuitry. It's built into our biology. The interaction between genetics and experience that shapes brain architecture is embedded in a reciprocal relationship, the relationships that children have with the adults in their lives. And by that we mean what we refer to as the serve and return nature of children's interaction with their adults' development. And the impact of experience on development is not a one-way street. It's a back-and-forth interaction. The brain is a highly integrated organ which has multiple sections that specialize in different kind of processes, so we have parts of the brain that are involved more in cognitive function and other parts that are involved in processing of emotion and parts involved in seeing and hearing. So if a child is emotionally put together and socially competent, that will affect more positive and productive learning. And if a child is preoccupied with fears or anxiety or is dealing with considerable stress, no matter how intellectually gifted that child might be, his or her learning is going to be impaired by that kind of emotional interference.
This illustration often used is the one that the monkeys and the typewriters. Okay, we have a monkey sitting at a typewriter, and the claim here is basically if you leave chance in time long enough you will get life. Don't worry about it. Yes, it's a strange, yes, it's wonderful. But leave enough matter 600 million years on Earth and you will have life. So, the monkey sitting at the typewriter, the chances are eventually he produces the complete works of Shakespeare, so what's the problem? So, there's no problem. There's no issue, right? You just leave it long enough and you'll find. And one key striker seconds, the monkey might well eventually get to you the complete works of Shakespeare, but he doesn't manage to do it in 600 million years. So, what I decided to do is to run the numbers. Instead of typing the complete work of Shakespeare, I just run the numbers for how long would it take a monkey typing one key striker a second. To type, to be or not to be, that is the question. Right? On average, how long is it going to take my monkey friend 1 keystroke a second? I don't know how you think it would be. Maybe you could have a guess. Would it be less or more than 600 million years, which is the period life on Earth isn't supposed to have emerged within, and when I run the numbers, to be or not to be is the question. Takes 12.6 trillion years to type just that phrase in a DNA string. That complexity emerges by chance undirected within 600 million years. Again, it's mathematically possible, but it's so incredibly unlikely that it would have that it tilts me in favor of the Christian story in which God creating life. Simply a question of saying let that be, and there was.
Well, it's about whether you can achieve a win-win solution, whether you can achieve economic growth, which brings wealth, in order to cut poverty without damaging biodiversity. And the argument is that if you want to protect biodiversity, you have to focus on that as a goal. But if you do that, you run the risk of hurting the poor, and you also run the risk of inconveniencing or reducing economic growth. And we're used in developed countries, industrialized countries, to seeing this argument, this axis argued about, with, let us say, a government wishing to start drilling for oil in place X, which is full of wildlife, and the Wildlife Conservation Society is urging them not to, on the grounds that it's a wilderness refuge. We're used to that debate. What I'm saying is that in the developing world, there's a third axis, and it's quite a complex one.
It is almost impossible these days not to include photography in a course on the history of art. I disagree with people such as Walter Benjamin who suggest that technology and don't go well together. Photography, with its realism, its accurate representation of the thing in front of you, initially deprived many artists of their subject matter, forcing them to look in new ways. No bad thing. True, mass-produced images of, say, the Mona Lisa, obviously can't provide the same experience as seeing the real painting. On the other hand, there are photographs which, to my mind, are far more thought-provoking and have greater emotional impact than a painting of the same subject could. Some people say that the traditional idea of an artist with a trained hand and eye is old-fashioned. They no longer believe that an artist needs specialist knowledge, but rather that he or she can simply point a camera at a scene and record it. However, on the one hand, that ignores the creative skill involved in producing photographs. On the other hand, it also ignores the fact that even in the past, painters used various technological aids. For example, the Dutch painter, Vermeer, used a camera obscura to help him create his images. We'll go into that later, but for now, Jay want to look at the documentary and cultural value of photography. One other keys to Apple is Apple's incredibly collaborative company, and so you know how many committees we have in Apple? 0. No committee. We are organized like a startup. One person's in charge of iPhone OS software, one person is in charge of Mac hardware. One person is in charge of iPhone hardware engineering, another person is in charge of worldwide marketing, another person's in charge of operations. We're organized like a startup. We're the biggest startup on the planet, and we all meet for 3 hours once a week and we talk about everything. We're doing the whole business, and there's tremendous teamwork at the top of the company, which filters down to tremendous teamwork throughout the company. And teamwork is dependent on trusting the other folks to come through with their part without watching them all the time, but trusting that they're gonna come through with their parts, and that's what we do really well, and we're great at figuring out how to divide things up in these great teams that we have and all work on the same thing, touch bases frequently, and bring it all together into a product. We do that really well, and so what I do all day is meet with teams of people and work on ideas and solve problems to make new products, to make new marketing programs, whatever it is.
This week I'd like to start by talking a bit about electric vehicles. Although we tend to think of electric cars as being something completely modern, they were in fact some of the earliest types of motorized vehicle. At the beginning of the 20th century, electric cars were actually more popular than cars with an internal combustion engine, as they were more comfortable to ride in. However, as cars fueled by petrol increased in importance, electric cars declined. The situation became such that electric vehicles were only used for certain specific purposes, as forklift trucks, ambulances and urban delivery vehicles, for example. Although electricity declined in use in road vehicles, it steadily grew in importance as a means of powering trains. Switzerland, for example, was quick to develop an electrified train system, encouraged in this no doubt by the fact that it had no coal or oil resources of its own. Nowadays there is renewed interest in electricity as a means of powering road vehicles. Why is this the case? Well, undoubtedly economic reasons are of considerable importance. The cost of oil has risen so sharply that there is a strong financial imperative to look for an alternative. However, there are also environmental motivations. Emissions from cars are blamed in large part for, among other things, the destruction of the ozone layer and the resultant rise in temperatures in the polar regions. A desire not to let things get any worse is also encouraging research into designing effective electric transport.
So there are two theories for how the gas giants formed. One is the same theory I showed you just now, core accretion, right? And the other is called disk instability. And one of our colleagues at DTM has done a lot of work on that. And so it's unclear exactly how they formed, but you're right, what we're trying to do, the reason we're trying to get to higher and higher pressure in the lab is because we're trying to understand more about the pressure inside the gas giants. It's thought that the gas giants also have a metallic core, but maybe a metallic core not made of iron. Hydrogen, for example, becomes metallic at a certain pressure. Okay, so it's very possible that the insides of these planets could have metallic cores, could have hydrogen cores, could have rocky portions. We're not sure, but the higher pressure we can get in the lab, the higher the pressure we can get in the lab, the closer we can get to understanding the interiors of the gas giants and the exoplanets that are so big.
In today's lecture, I'm going to talk about changes in air pollution since the middle of the last century and what has created these changes. So, by the 1950s, air pollution was very visible, with frequent thick black fogs known as smogs in many large cities around the world. The main source of this pollution was from factories, and it caused severe health problems. For example, a particularly severe smog in London in 1952 caused over 4,000 deaths. Obviously, something had to be done, and in 1956, a Clean Air Act was introduced in Britain. This addressed the pollution from factories, and the smog soon disappeared. However, as you know, these days air pollution is still a big issue. The main difference between now and the 1950s is that you can't see it, it's invisible. Also, the main source of pollution now is from cars and lorries, and although these don't produce visible signs, this air pollution is still a significant risk to health. And one of the key factors in the rise of this type of pollution is that we have all become much more vehicle dependent. There are far more cars and lorries, trains and planes than in the 1950s, and this is now the main source of air pollution around the world.